I guess we'll get going, everybody. So it's my real pleasure today to introduce our colloquium speaker, Professor Andrea Liu. Andrea is joining us from the University of Pennsylvania, where she's the Hepburn Professor of Physics and the Director of the new Center for Soft and Living Matter. Andrea has a long history here in California. She earned her undergraduate degree in physics at UC Berkeley. Then she went across the country and took her PhD in physics at Cornell with Michael Fisher. And then after postdoctoral stints at Exxon and the University of California, Santa Barbara, she started at UCLA in 1993 and then moved to her current position in Penn in 2004. So as a soft matter physicist, Andrea is particularly well known for her work on jamming, which describes the emergent rigidity and slow relaxation of disordered systems as they're exposed to increasing densities and pressures. I guess I first got to know Andrea's work pretty well about a decade ago through some really beautiful applications of machine learning to try to predict which parts of a disordered system will move. And then maybe most interestingly, in my opinion, being able to go and examine the guts of their machine learning algorithm and actually learn something new about the underlying physics, which I thought was particularly cool. In recent years, she and a group have been kind of turning this picture around and instead have been trying to think about how physical systems themselves can engage in a form of learning, although one that's maybe quite a bit different from how our brains or computer algorithms melt through it. In recognition of this work, Andrea's received numerous awards, probably too many for me to list today, but maybe just to mention a few. She's now a Simons Investigator in Theoretical Physics, a Fellow of the American Physical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. So it's our real pleasure to have Andrea here to deliver the colloquium today. So thank you.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I'm going to talk, just a sort of a trigger warning here. I'm going to talk about ideas that are not fully baked, but that I'm so excited about, I just can't stop thinking about and talking about them. So I'll try to indicate, what the boundaries of what we know is, and they're all over the place in this. Okay, the title of my talk is Many More is Different, and this came from thinking about how there are systems that are very, very different from ordinary condensed matter systems. So, of course, Phil Andersen, coined the motto of condensed matter physics, which is more is different, meaning that more is different from a few, one or a few, right? That the collective properties are so different. But if you think about many more, it's about the same as more. I mean, phase transitions get sharper as you go from more to many more, right? But simulations of, say, 10,000 particles can tell you a lot about what happens in experiments on 10 to the 20, right? So many more is really pretty close to more, usually. But there are systems which really break that rule, right? Of course, brains. Compare C. elegans to honeybees to humans, right? With that increase of size comes a huge increase of what the brains can do, or at least we like to think so. And digital neural networks too, right? If you compare the neural networks in the 1980s, which were just academic curiosities, to what they're doing now, where they're everywhere, they got so much more useful because they got a lot bigger. They can do a lot more. And that, in fact, that's the name of the game. And so what I want to talk to you today is just some thoughts about, okay, why is many more different from more? What does it take for many more to be different? For example, okay. And the second thing is, what kinds of physical systems, leaving brains aside, okay, might have this property that many more is different? And finally, how can we design a very simple physical system that we can sort of think about, that's simple enough so that we can start thinking about and studying, that has this property? Okay, so why is many more different in digital neural networks? Well, let's think for a minute about what they do and how they do it. Okay, so neural networks, you give them a bunch of inputs, for example, pixels of an image, right? And then you want to, say, classify them into images of dogs and cats. Everybody always says that, so I'm going to stick with tradition, okay? And the idea is you train these, they're free parameters on these networks. That I'm going to call control degrees of freedom. They're just called parameters usually. Okay, I'm going to call them control degrees of freedom to make it clear that they can be adjusted. Okay, and they're controlled because they're adjusted to do something. Okay, so that you can control something. And the idea is that you construct a control cost function or a loss function, right, where you have this thing where you crank the thing through. You put in the outputs, you put in the inputs, you crank out the outputs. They're going to be wrong, right? Because you don't have the right control degrees of freedom. They're not adjusted right. So the answer comes out wrong. You compare that, what I'm going to call the free output, where I just apply the inputs, okay, and let the outputs be what they want to be free, to the desired output. You don't know which is bigger, so you have to square it. And you sum over this, and the idea and training examples, and then you minimize this with respect to those control degrees of freedom, okay? To take this thing to 0, and then it's trained, right? So that's the idea of how this works. All right, so that's what you're doing. And why is many more different in these systems? Well, as they get bigger and bigger, you have more control degrees of freedom, right? So you have more degrees of freedom, you can satisfy more constraints, and that allows them to do more things. So it's that simple. You just have numbered control degrees of freedom increasing. So then let's start thinking then about physical systems that might have this property, that have control degrees of freedom that increase with system size, that can be adjusted to learn things, okay? All right. So let's think about, for example, let's go back to our digital neural networks then and think about them again and say, all right, what kinds of things do they learn? If we can figure out what they learn, then we can look for physical systems that learn similar things, okay, and look in those systems for control degrees of freedom. Okay, so that's the idea. What do they learn? Well, they learn to give desired outputs in response to inputs, right? And in physics terms, what we want to say is the inputs are stimuli. We're putting in stimuli, and we want a desired response over here, okay, to those stimuli, okay? So now these artificial neural networks, of course, digital neural networks, live on the computer. They aren't real, okay? And so the question is, can we find real systems that have desired responses to stimuli, and then ask, do they have control degrees of freedom? So the first thing we started thinking about back in 2015 was proteins with allostery, okay? So think of an enzyme, for example. Enzymes are very unlike, they're catalysts, right? They catalyze chemical reactions, but they're very different from man-made catalysts. Man-made catalysts just go until they get fouled and then they quit, okay? Biological catalysts, enzymes, can be turned on and off, okay, at will. And the way they turn them on and off is often through this mechanism called allostery. So the idea is the following. You have this molecule, okay, that wants to bind to the protein and then go off chemically modified, okay? Right now, the way it's drawn, it can't bind. And it can't bind until this other kind of molecule, called the regulatory molecule, binds over here, that somehow changes the conformation of the protein so that this thing can now bind. Okay? So that's an example of turning the enzyme on. This green molecule, by binding here, turns it on. Okay? There are other ways, you can also have allostery to turn it off. Enzymes off, okay? So this is widely used in many, many proteins. And when we think about it, this is a response to a stimulus, right? That I'm applying, if I think about this in mechanical terms, I'm applying some local strain over here, okay? In response, I'm getting some strain over here, okay? That's my response. And what are my control degrees of freedom? Do I have them? Yes, I do, right? I have the choice of which amino acid to put at each side of at each point in the sequence. Of course, it also the protein needs to fold. It may need to do other things as well, okay? But one of the things is that sequence of amino acids has been chosen by evolution so that the system has been adjusted by evolution so that the system has allostery, okay? So, and what do we have? We have 20 amino acids at each point in the sequence. Clearly, the number of control degrees of freedom, which is the choice of these amino acids, is growing with system size. Okay? So indeed, that is fitting this picture. Here's another example that I learned from my wonderful colleague, Eleni Catafori, okay, which is the brain vasculature. So this is the network of blood vessels that feeds the brain. It actually uses 25% of the oxygen that comes into our bodies. It uses a lot of it, okay? And that's used to support brain function. So right now I'm talking, my speech cortex needs more oxygen. I hope your auditory cortices are also taking up more oxygen, okay? And the way the brain vasculature does it is it sends more oxygen by sending more blood flow to your auditory cortices, okay? And how does it do that? It changes the conductance of blood vessels in this network, okay? So that some of them get wider and others get thinner, okay? It changes their diameter, that changes the conductance. It goes like the fourth power. Okay, so a very effective way of changing conductance. And if you think about it, again, it's an input-output thing. I have the input, which is a pressure drop at the arteries. I have output, which is an enhanced pressure drop at my speech cortex. Okay, and my control degrees of freedom are the conductances of the network edges, the edges, the vessels that connect nodes in this network.
How are they controlled?
Yeah, people don't know, actually. Neurons are involved, but people don't know actually how it's controlled. But this is how fMRI works, right? Is they're looking at the oxygen, yeah, to see which parts of your brain are being used. Okay, so yeah, it's a really cool system. So it turns out that if you're going to think about proteins and brain vasculature, you might as well think about them at the same time. Because the mechanical networks are very simple, if I'm going to try to, if I'm going to construct a simple model to understand these, I should think about them at the same time. Because a very simple model of a protein is a network of beads connected by springs, central force springs, okay? And in such a model, right, it has to minimize the energy. In other words, I don't want any acceleration on the nodes. So all the forces on each node have to balance, okay? In the flow networks, you have something very similar. You have Kirchhoff's law, okay? All the currents at every node have to balance, okay? And so the mathematics is almost the same. So you might as well do the same. It's just that this is a vector problem. I'm balancing vector forces. Here I just have scalar currents in the flow networks. And I just want to point out here that low Reynolds number of flow networks are identical to linear electrical resistor networks. It's just that, pressure you translate to voltage. Okay, conductance is still conductance, current is current. Okay, so flow networks and electrical resistor networks are really the same here, okay, and very similar to mechanical networks. All right, so let's try then, so we start thinking about, let's develop simple models to understand allostery, okay, and how are we going to do it? Well, we're going to borrow from how people train digital neural networks. We're going to construct a cost function. Okay, a loss function, which says I apply my source strain. Okay, here's my central force spring network. I apply some source strain. I'm just going to call that 1. Okay, and then I want a target strain response, which is delta. Okay, so what do? I take my source and I let my target to be free what it wants to be. That's ET. Okay, and I compare that to delta, which is what I want it to be. okay, the desired target strain to the free target strain. Again, I don't know which is bigger, so I'm going to square it. And then I'm going to minimize this with respect to controlled degrees of freedom. And what are they here? Well, they can be the stiffnesses of the springs, they can be the equilibrium lengths of the springs, or you could say each spring could be there or not there, okay? Any kind of degree of freedom that I allow on that edge will work, okay? And then I'm done, right? If it were an artificial neural network, I'd be done. But I'm not done because this is a physical system. And because it's a physical system, I have to have force balance at every node, which is equivalent to minimizing the energy with respect to the positions of the nodes, okay? So I need to do a double descent, gradient descent. I need to minimize in two different landscapes at once. I need to minimize this control cost function, okay, with respect to my control degrees of freedom, okay, which are the spring stiffnesses. But as I do that, right, I'm changing the forces on the springs. And so I need to rebalance them and minimize the energy with respect to the node positions. So I need to do these two things simultaneously until I have, if I then reach 0 on this, I will have gotten the desired response. Okay? So that's what we did. And it works, okay? So this is just reading out the strain. So I put on a unit strain here, okay? And I'm reading out the strain here, and I'm tuning the stiffnesses of the springs. And you see, as I tune them, the target strain is going up and up until it reaches 1, the same value as my input. Okay, so there's my input, there's my output, and now they're the same. I got what I wanted. Okay, so, and we can do this, why not? In a flow network as well, that works too, okay? Where there my control cost function is I look at the pressure in the free case, okay? So just the pressure that comes out here when I apply a pressure drop here of 1, and I compare it to the pressure drop I want. I'm going to square it, I'm going to minimize it with respect to, in this case, the edge conductances, but at the same time I have to satisfy Kirchhoff's law. That's equivalent to minimizing the power that this thing dissipates with respect to the node pressures, okay? And again, I do this double gradient descent, and this is here, this is a system, the initial target pressure drop is very small, and as I tune the conductances, it goes up and up, okay, until it eventually reaches the desired value. In this case, it was 0.2. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
Can I think of like a separation of timescales between these two minimization processes?
Yes. So people, yes. So you really, what happens, right, is that you want to adjust the control degrees of freedom more slowly than the physical degrees of freedom, okay? And in fact, you would think you have to do it in the quasi-static limit so that the physical degrees of freedom are always equilibrated. In fact, we found that we could raise the rate of physical equilibration to be almost the same as raise the rate of learning to be almost as fast as the rate of physical equilibration until they were almost the same, okay, within like half an order of magnitude without any cost and error, essentially. And then at that point, then the error just jumps way up, okay, and it doesn't work. But you can also tune in the opposite limit, where the learning degrees of freedom equilibrate much more rapidly than the physical degrees of freedom. That actually works too. Okay, so it's just the in between where they're the same, where you have to be careful. Okay, so now we've got a system. It's learned an input-output response. Okay, it has the number of control degrees of freedom is scaling a system size. Okay, does it have the property that many more is different? Okay, so now we have one source, and now let's try to tune n sub t targets all to have the same response delta. Okay, and this is what you get as your system size increases. Okay, so the red is the smallest system, And as I go this way, I'm going to larger and larger systems. So what am I plotting? I'm plotting what is the probability that I end up with all of my targets satisfied. Okay? With all of my targets having the response delta. Okay? And it starts out at 1, and now as I increase the number of targets, that's what's being plotted here, as I increase the number of targets, at some point it plunges down, okay, and I'm not able to satisfy them anymore. I can't handle that many targets, okay? So if I look at the number of targets I can handle, okay, it turns out that we can collapse all these curves onto a single plot, and we get power law scaling, so that the maximum number of targets I can handle scales like the system size, the number of nodes raised to a power, okay? At the same time, the width of this interface, okay, the width of this transition from satisfying everybody to not satisfying everybody goes to 0, okay? So, so what's happening, the width, the width is scaling as a sublinear power of n as well. Okay, so relative to the number, it is going to 0. Okay, so so this transition is becoming a first-order transition, infinitely sharp in the thermodynamic limit. Okay, so so yes, many more is definitely different. I can satisfy more and more targets as my system gets bigger. Okay, but many more is different. We're very happy to say, in a familiar way, in a way that we know how to handle. It's like a phase transition, and it's what's called a constraint satisfaction transition, and that's something, we know how to handle this. But there's a complication here, which is that I have actually 2 sets of degrees of freedom. I have my control degrees of freedom, and I have my physical degrees of freedom. Okay? And does that change anything? It does. Because it turns out that if you change, here's my source, if I change targets close to the source, okay, before I change targets that are further away, then I can actually tune more targets than if I tune them in random order. That's because there's frustration. There's geometric frustration coming about because this is living in space, okay? And if we change our cost function to weight more heavily the targets that are close to the source, so that I want to satisfy them first before I satisfy them the other ones, then I can change that scaling. Okay, I can change that power law. And in fact, in the limit of really tuning in order of distance from the source, it turns out that I don't get a phase transition at all. That the number of targets just increases linearly with with the system size. I can just tune more and more, and the width of the transition is scaling linearly as well. Okay, so so this is saying that this is weird because in these systems, the control degrees of freedom are there to minimize the control cost function, and that's saying the control degrees of freedom are there to minimize what I want them to minimize. And what I say I want, okay, what I'm choosing for that control cost function is affecting how many more is different, okay? So there's something that we don't understand here. This is actually quite subtle that I think and interesting about how these systems behave. But let me go on now to another system, okay, which has desired input-output relations. Okay, and that is systems that that are networks of biological filaments that are there to make things very stiff. Okay, to make things to maintain rigidity. So the first one is the actin cortex. So this is the network of actin filaments that gives the cell its shape and rigidity. Okay. The second one is the collagen extracellular matrix, so it lives in between our cells. Okay, that also is rigid. And the third one is blood clots. Okay, fibrin blood clots. Very important for the blood clot to remain rigid. Right. So all of these things, their purpose in life is to keep things rigid, and they have to maintain rigidity over very different stress states. right? The cell could be crawling, it could be under all kinds of different things. The blood clot, you could be flexing it this way, that way. It has to remain rigid, okay?
I mean,
Yeah.
viscoelastic, I mean, some of those ones you described.
It depends on what time scale you want to talk about. If you're looking at time scales over which, right, which are changing things, and it's viscoelastic. Okay, and this is a kind of problem that a computer scientist would not look at. Like, I feed it very, very different inputs, and I want the output always to be about the same, right? Not very interesting from a computer science point of view, but quite interesting in this case from the biological point of view that we want something like that, okay? Now, if you look at these three systems, they all do things in the same way, okay? It's very interesting. So they are networks that are what are called under-coordinated. So if I think about each node has 3 degrees of freedom in 3 dimensions, x, y, and z, right? I need to hold that in place through the edges that are connected to this. That means each edge is shared between 2, so I need at least 6 edges on average to constrain each node, okay? That argument goes back to Maxwell. These don't have 6, they have 4. In the case of actin, it's cross-linked. And in the case of collagen, it often has 3 because it's sort of a branching network, and fibrin as well. Sometimes 4, sometimes 3, somewhere between 3 and 4 on average. So they don't actually have enough edges to constrain all the degrees of freedom. So you think they should be fluid, they shouldn't be rigid, okay? But they are rigid because of pre-stress, because they're under tension, and that's called tensegrity. Right? You put under-coordinated things under tension and they can be rigid. Okay, so that means they have to maintain a level of tension on every edge, on these edges, in order to keep them rigid. That seems like, oh, that's going through a lot of work. Why didn't they just do 6? Okay? Not only that though, they all have enzymes that tend to cut filaments and take them away, okay, if they're under low tension. Okay, cofilin in the case of actin, collagenase in the case of collagen, and filamin for fibrin. Okay? And the filaments are assembling and disassembling. So this seems an insane way to maintain rigidity. In fact, if you think about the actin network, every edge on it turns over, is removed and replaced by a different one every minute. The whole network is turning over every minute. Like, if I told you, go and build something rigid, you wouldn't do it this way, okay? So why is this a good way to do it, okay? Why is this a good strategy? Well, it seems crazy until you think about it from the point of view of, the way machine learning does things, okay? What are we doing? When we have this turnover, when we take away edges and add them back in, we're adding controlled degrees of freedom. It's a binary degree of freedom. Each edge can be there or not there, okay? So I'm adding this degree of freedom, and the number of controlled degrees of freedom is increasing with my system size, okay? Because I have so many controlled degrees of freedom, I have lots of them, the system, its job is to maintain rigidity, okay? It's reasonable to say, well, maybe it's over-parameterized. In other words, I have a lot more degrees of freedom than I have constraints that I'm trying to satisfy with them, okay? Well, we know from machine learning, from AI, okay, why people always over-parameterize things. People always use neural networks that are way too big for what you want, because then they're easy to train. Because then it's easy to get good solutions, okay? And in fact, there are many, many good solutions. Well, why is that good? Well, because each filamentous network is different, right? Each cell has a different actin cortex, but they're all maintaining rigidity, okay? And what else do we know about over-parameterization? Well, systems are more likely to fall into minima with bigger basins of attraction, so that while there may be a few directions in the learning landscape, or the control landscape, so if I think about the control cost function in that very high dimensional space of all the controlled degrees of freedom, right, that base space, right, there are a few directions that have very high curvature, but most directions are very, very flat, which means I can go a long way in those directions and not change rigidity very much. So I can maintain rigidity even though I'm changing my parameters, whether I have these edges or not, a lot. Okay? That's very important for turnover, right? And in fact, there's this thing in neuroscience, representational drift, that if you think about the neurons, you remember something from your childhood. But at different periods, if you look at which neurons are holding that memory, they're changing. Okay? And that's what's happening here. Despite that turnover, the network is changing. Okay? The edges that are preserving that memory are changing, and yet it's remembering to be rigid. Okay? So this way of thinking about things provides an answer to why the actin cortex does things that way, or the collagen extracellular matrix. It's not so crazy after all. It makes a lot of sense. It's actually brilliant. Okay? All right, so I've given you then what physical systems besides the brains might have this property, and I've argued, well, if you look at systems that have desired input-output relations, in other words, biological functions, right? Systems that have either adaptive functions so that they can change all the time, okay, under very different conditions, they can adapt to different conditions, or that have adapted by evolution, okay, these kinds of systems, you know, are good ones to look at that have this property that many more is different. Okay, so let me go on to the next thing then, which is, can we design now a very simple physical system? We want the simplest possible system that can have this property. How can we do that? Okay, and if you think about all of these things, how do they tune their control degrees of freedom? Well, in a digital neural network, you put it on a computer, and it's a very expensive calculation to figure out in this very high dimensional space of all the parameters. So Google Translate has 1 billion parameters, ChatGPT 4 about 1 trillion. Okay, so in this trillion dimensional space, you have to say which way is downhill, the fastest way downhill, right? That's expensive. That requires processors. But somehow, in these systems, allosteric proteins, they change their amino acid sequence through evolution. Okay, that's evolution you can think of as a way of going downhill on your control cost function. What about the brain vasculature? As I said, we don't know how it does it. What about biological filamentous networks? We have a partial answer, not complete. But one thing I can tell you, these edges, these systems are not connected to a computer, which is figuring out what's the best way to go downhill, right? They're somehow managing to do this without a processor, okay? So that led us to think, okay, how can systems learn these sort of input-output relations then on their own without a processor? So, of course, the brain can do it, so let's go back and think about the brain for a minute. And if you think about it, the brain has enormous advantages over digital neural networks, okay? So digital neural networks, of course, live on the processor, and these don't need a processor. Our brains are not connected to computers. They manage to update themselves. How do they do that? Well, unlike the digital neural network, we have to know every detail of the network in order to figure out how to go downhill, okay? In the brain, each neuron is updating its connections without knowing what every other neuron is doing. That's called a local rule, okay? So it's somehow doing that. And because of that, learning is distributed. It's happening in parallel on all these different neurons at the same time. It's very robust to damage, right? There are people who have, very unfortunately, extremely severe epilepsy, and they need to have half their brains removed, and yet they can, they can function as normal people. They can function quite well. Also, people can recover from strokes. Okay, so it's the learning in the brain is quite robust to damage. That's good. And if you think about it, the brain is doing an enormous number of different things during the course of a day, but it does it on very little power, 2,000 kilojoules per day. That's a huge fraction of the food we eat, right? It's about a quarter of the food we eat, 1/5 to 1/4 of the food we eat. So we're spending a lot of money, spending a lot of food on our brains, okay, energy on our brains, okay, but it's a lot less than something like ChatGPT. So to generate an image on ChatGPT, I don't know if you know, it's the same amount of energy that it takes to drive the average electric car 10 miles. Okay, this is not free. It is a tremendous amount of energy. That's 5 times the amount that the entire brain uses in a day. Okay, so think about that. When you use these things, you're using an enormous amount of energy. And that's a problem, okay? So that's actually a problem with digital neural networks. They're running to a wall of sustainability. Okay, so what we thought was, okay, let's not try to be the brain. The brain's too complicated for us. But let's try for us, not for everybody, but just for me. So take one step closer to the brain, right? Just one step by coming up with local rules that minimize this control cost function. So how do you do that? The idea is to use physics. So remember that our control cost function, I'm sorry, I keep calling it different names. Our control cost function was, I'm going to compare the free response to the one I want, the desired response. Okay? So I apply the source here and I let the target be free and I compare that to what I want and I'm going to square it. Okay? Instead of doing that, let's think of the contrast function. Okay? That's the power in the clamp state minus the power in the free. So what is that? Why do I choose power? I choose power because that's what in my electrical network, here now I'm talking about electrical network, wants to be minimized to satisfy Kirchhoff's law at every node. Physics says I have to do this. Okay? So I'm taking power. And what's the clamp state? The clamp state is, instead of letting the target be free, I apply the response that I want. Okay? So that's the desired response. So what I want is for the power in the clamped to be the same as the power in the free. In fact, I want the clamped and the free states to be the same. That if I don't apply anything, I already get what I want. Okay? So I changed this to looking at the power under 2 different boundary conditions. Okay? Clamped and free. The great thing is I know that the system wants to minimize the power, right? So now I take off the clamp, right? I don't, instead of applying the desired target response, I let it be free. The system's just going to go right back to this. That tells me that the power in the clamp state has to be greater than or equal to the power in the free state. I didn't have to square it, and I already know that it's not negative. Okay? And that's the magic of it, because if I don't square it, and now let me do gradient descent on the conductance of each edge on this power. I want every edge by edge, I want each edge's contribution to the power and the clamped and the free to be the same. Okay? I end up getting this relation. Everything drops out in the sum except for I equals j. And I end up with the conductance. Changing the conductance on edge j just depends on the voltage drop across that edge in the clamp state and minus what it is in the free state. Okay? That's what I mean by a local rule. I didn't have to know what every edge was doing in order to adjust the conductance on this edge. Okay? And that was possible due to this fact due to physics. Okay? So that's the key. All right? So this was a pandemic thing. I was working on this. We're stuck at home. My husband, Doug Durian, is a soft matter experimentalist. And I was saying, this is such a great local rule. We need to implement it in the lab. It's no good on the computer. We have to do this in the lab. Why does it have to be done in the lab? Because, all right, of the following. I've now gotten around, I remember I was doing double gradient descent to get a desired response, output response. So I've replaced the second descent, okay, with this local rule, excellent, but I still have the first one. I still have to satisfy Kirchhoff's law at every node. And that has to be done on the computer. Haha, but not if you do it in the lab. Because if you do it in the lab, if you actually do it on a real circuit, physics will do that for you. You don't have to lift a finger. Okay? So That was the idea. Like, this has to be done in the lab in order for it to be any good. Because then physics does this, we have a local rule that does that, and then we've got learning without a computer. Okay? So Doug thought about it, okay, and he came back and said, I think I have a way to do this. Okay? Now what's the problem with this? So the good thing is, all right, there are digital variable resistors, and this was the idea of, we hired a postdoc, Sam DeLaVue, started in September 2020 to do this. These digital variable resistors can take on, different resistor values, and you control what they are. Okay, but the problem is, how do I compare the voltage drop across each resistor and the clamped and the free? Because usually how we would do it on the computer, we'd apply the clamp boundary condition, put it in memory, okay? Apply the free boundary condition, take that one, the clamped out of memory, compare the two, okay, and then update. We don't want memory, we don't want to use a computer, okay? How do we do this? We can't apply two sets of boundary conditions to the same system at the same time. So the idea Doug came up with is to build identical twin networks. Okay, so you have two twin networks. This one runs the free boundary condition, this one runs the clamped. Each edge of the clamped is sitting on top of the edge of the free, so each edge here is really two edges, okay? So here's a picture of the edge that Sam built, one of the edges that Sam built on a breadboard. Okay, there's the free variable resistor, there's the clamped, and the rest is circuitry to compare the two, okay, the voltage drop across the edge under these two for the identical twins, and then you adjust both of them together so they remain the same. So they start the same, you adjust both the same, they stay the same, okay? And this circuitry actually didn't even do the exact coupled learning rule, it did just a discretized version of it, just clicked up one step or down one step in this variable resistor according to the sign of this difference. Okay? So Sam put this together and we couldn't believe it. Okay, so there's our network, 9 nodes and 16 edges, the blue lines are the edges connecting the nodes, which are the circles. Okay, so that's our first generation prototype, okay, that Sam built, and we couldn't believe it. It actually worked. It still blows me away that it worked. So here's the most complicated thing we did. We were extremely proud of this. Computer scientists completely turned their noses at it, and we kept being told by the reviewers, if you can't classify ImageNet, which has like 10 million images, don't even talk to us. Okay, okay. But here is our task. Okay, so this is the iris data set. So there are 4 measurements of the iris, the length and the width of the petals and sepals. Okay, and the idea is there are 3 different species of irises, and given these measurements, okay, these 4 measurements, figure out which species it is. Okay, so some poor guy a long time ago measured all these 4 numbers, okay, for 50 flowers from each species, so 150 flowers altogether, okay? And the idea is you train on 10 of them and then you test on the remaining 40, okay? And so here is our network. So we have one node which sets ground, okay? We have to establish ground, and then we input these measurements, these 4 measurements as translate into voltages through 4 nodes, okay? 1 for each measurement. And then we have 3 targets, 1 for each species. So this one has only 1 extra node left over. This is really the most complicated thing we could do with this system.
How did you choose which are sources and which are targets, or that was just?
It was just random.
Make any choice?
We can pretty much make any choice, okay? And with this, we got a classification accuracy of 97%, which is as well as you can do with any linear classifier on the computer. Okay, so we were very impressed by that. Okay, we were very happy. Okay, so, but it turns out these networks are not good enough. Okay, they are what are called linear networks, where the output response has to be linear in the inputs because it's an electrical resistor network, okay? And that means that the number of learning degrees, the number of control, degrees of freedom does not increase with system size. It turns out that you can take this network and you can map it onto a fully connected network of just the input and output nodes and with effective resistances that you can adjust. Okay? So that means that it's just growing with the number of inputs and outputs, but not with the actual network size, the number of control degrees of freedom. And we know also that linear machine learning models are not very powerful. And they can't learn, for example, XOR or nonlinear classification or regression, no matter how large they are. They just can't do it, okay? So that means we need nonlinear networks. So we need nonlinear networks, and we need that for the number of, I'm sorry, I regressed on my note language, control degrees of freedom to increase with system size in order for many more to be different. Okay, we need nonlinearity. So that's our second generation. Okay, so our second generation, instead of being discrete and linear, is now, it's a continuous change, in this case of a gate voltage, and nonlinear. So it's a transistor-based design, which means that it's easily microfabricated onto chips. Okay, and each edge has a slightly nonlinear IV curve. Okay, I'm just going to tell you, here's the, we just defaulted to a square lattice. Okay, so now this is the simplest lattice. Okay, square lattice of edges connected by nodes. So in this case, we have, I think, 25 edges. Well, maybe not. Anyway. Connected by 16 nodes connected by 25 edges, something like that. The amazing thing is that this system, even on a breadboard, where it's really big and the capacitance is large, okay, so it's slow, it's already 30 times faster than solving this on the computer, basically because satisfying Kirchhoff's law at every node is very fast for the physics, okay, but for nonlinear resistors, very hard on the computer. It takes a long time on the computer, not very efficient on the computer. So to scale this up and to study this, we really need to do this in experiment, not on the computer. But this thing does nonlinear classification. So I'm just going to show you an example. So this is, I have two inputs, okay? And so this is a plot of the inputs, and I have blue points and I have gold points. Okay, and those are my training examples. And the idea is to find out where the dividing surface is between the blue and the gold, so that when I put in some point in here, it'll tell me, it should be blue. Or if I put in somewhere here, it'll tell me it should be yellow. Okay, so the answer, the test answer, is the color. And you can see that the color is not correct. It's quite blue here, and it should be yellow. Okay, so all of here it should be blue, all here it should be yellow. And this is the black is the dividing surface between the two. So as this thing goes, you see it first adjusts, and then what you see is the surface actually curves. Okay, that curvature of the surface is what tells you this is nonlinear. A resistor network would not be able to do that. Okay, so this thing can learn nonlinear classification. All right. Now, remember I said that brains were incredibly robust to damage, okay? This is a stupid example to show that if you saw an iPhone in half, it doesn't work. Okay, stupid analogy. But anyway, here's the thing. So this is our first generation. We had to learn something, okay? The thing we had to learn, here's ground, here's 5 volts, I feed it. And I want to have 4 volts there and 2 volts there, okay? So it learned it, okay? So here's the error went down, it learned it. But now I rip out this edge, okay? I damage it. Okay, it got bad, right? The error got bad, but it got high, but now it learned it again, okay? I rip out the yellow one. Again, the error went up, and it learns it again. The purple one, I rip it out, it didn't make any difference. In fact, most of them you rip it out, it doesn't make any difference, and that's known in our, digital neural networks as well. Okay, and so, in fact, we could rip out about 1/3 of the network, and it could still learn it again. It could learn around defects, and that's incredibly important. In fact, Sam found that these circuits were held to debug because they always worked. So he would put in inputs and outputs, everything worked. It was right. And he'd just fiddle around, let me put them here, let me put them there. Everything would work. Then suddenly he put in one input over here, and it would stop working. Why? It turned out there was a bad edge over there. Okay? And that bad edge, the system would learn around unless you place the input in exactly the wrong place, then it couldn't learn around it. Okay? So these circuits are really robust, and they correct errors on their own. And that's really important for manufacturing, for manufacturability, because if we want to now microfabricate this onto a chip, there are bound to be lots of manufacturing errors, but if the system can learn around it, we're in good shape. Okay? So maybe this will be useful, right? So what's great about it, it's robust to damage. A lot of the designs people have, don't have that, and that's a serious problem. Here, the parameter changes are calculated in parallel. Every edge is just adjusting all the time on its own, right? Without knowing what all the other edges are doing. Why is this leading to collective learning across the whole circuit? Because they're coupled through Kirchhoff's law at every node, right? So these local changes are coupled. Right now, in our second generation on the breadboards, okay, the amount of energy that it takes to perform an already learned task is linear in the number of, per parameter is 10 picojoules. That's actually within striking distance of doing a digital neural network, okay, on the most energy efficient state-of-the-art chips, okay, which is 1 picojoules per parameter. If we put this on a chip, we get many orders of magnitude more. So the idea is, our next step is here's our printed circuit boards. Of course, our first set of printed circuit boards, we only did 5 because we knew they wouldn't work, and in fact they didn't work upon a stupid bug. Fixed it, so we'll get our next batch any day now. With these, we should be able to go up to 100 or 200 edges or parameters, okay? But in principle, okay, then the idea is to take it to microfabrications with not very, with 1980s technology, we should be able to get to about 10 million edges or a million edges on a chip. Our third generation design actually uses sub-threshold transistors to do everything, so it's extremely energy efficient, even fewer components per edge, and so we estimate we could get up to 1 billion edges on using state-of-the-art microfabrication onto chips. And that the energy to calculate the outputs, given the inputs for an already trained network, should be 10 to the minus 18 joules, okay, 1 attojoule, so beating out this by 6 orders of magnitude. That's if it scales up. That's a big if, okay? We don't know, but we're excited about this. We're trying it. Okay. So just to sum up, right? What I showed you was that this idea of double gradient descent simultaneously optimize both a control cost function and a physical cost function. In other words, what physics says we have to minimize, okay, gives you a way of solving inverse design problems for real systems, okay? And that's very general. And I showed you this coupled learning idea, which it's a framework for saying, okay, for a given input-output response that you want, here's a way to come up with a local rule to do it, okay? And so that's a very nice thing. It's very general. It's also very robust that it actually works in a real system. We had trouble believing that, but it does. And the fact that it's so massively scalable and so energy efficient says that, okay, maybe it's going to be useful for example, for edge devices where you don't want to replace the battery all the time, okay? Or if you care about sustainability, okay? And that's our simple physical model. It's that circuit, okay? It's really quite simple. It's electronics, we can understand that. We know all these things. So that's our, are analog to the Ising model for systems with many controlled degrees of freedom as well as physical degrees of freedom, where many more should be different. And that's really, I think, an interesting kind of condensed matter to study, not what we're used to, and I think quite important for understanding function in living matter. So thanks very much for your attention, and let me thank the people who really did the work, okay, especially Naki Stern, who came up with the coupled learning rule, and Sam Dilleville, who implemented it in the circuits with Doug Durian and Mark Miskin, Mark Miskin designed the second and third generation networks. He's a brilliant young colleague of ours in electrical engineering at Penn. And all the people who were involved in all of this work going back, decades. My work with Sid Nagel leading to this. Thanks.
Great. We've time for a few questions.
Go ahead.
At the end, you were describing a machine you made, and I'm a little vague about what this machine actually does. It seems to be there's an electrical signal that you put in to stimulate it, and then another one
Voltage.
that you want to get out.
Voltage
And
outputs.
this is a scalar voltage, is it?
Scalar voltage.
Now,
Voltage
is the
inputs,
function
voltage
that
outputs.
you want to get out, you put any voltage in, and some function of it comes out on the other side?
Yes. So what comes out is a function of the inputs. The output voltage is a function of the inputs. It can be a complicated nonlinear function of the inputs. Okay, and but the idea is you want that. You have specified what you want that target to be, that output to be.
What I'm struggling with is that you built an analog filter. So it's an analog function that you give it pair examples, and it's learning the function.
Doesn't have to. That one learned pair examples. We could have done triplet examples.
What I'm trying to
Yes, but yes.
asking this question: is it scalar to? I mean, is it floating point to floating point? In other words, is it
Yes.
is a real value function?
Yes.
And so there, I'm completely off the circuit because that has error bars on it. And
Yes.
so it's
It had error. It's analog.
and so it doesn't make any sense then to say that it works. Okay? It
Ah.
has to work within some error.
Yeah, it works within some error, exactly. So here's the error. Okay? So it depends on what you want to do. So the classification error can be very
So
low.
this means nothing. It means square voltage, right? What I need to see is a function, voltage in, voltage out versus voltage out. There will be some curve. And then I'm going to see how well it reproduces this curve.
Ah, yeah, I have an example of that. Let me see if I have it here. If I don't have it here, I have it in another talk. Yeah, you can see that for example, for nonlinear regression, how well it works. It does very well. Let me see if I can find the talk. Oh. Citric acid. I'm not finding it. I'm sorry. there's a limit to how much time I should spend finding a slide. But we have a nonlinear curve, okay? We have one that has a nonlinear curve. Let me go back. Again, two inputs. So you know, some curve like this with a bunch of training points, right? And then we want to fit that curve, and it does quite well. Okay, so again, to order about 10 to the minus 3, 10 to the minus 4 in the variance around those points. Okay, so yeah.
I have a question about the Windows design. Is it true that you can use almost every node that's both input and output?
Yeah.
There's no limit, or you can only...
There is a limit. There's a limit, right? So we were able to do that, and there were still enough edges. It was still over parameterized, so we found a solution. But yeah, there's a limit to how many you can do. Yeah.
Do you know how over-parameterized it has to be by an order 1 factor, or does the over-parameterization factor grow as the network grows?
It seems to be, in terms of how many targets we can, just for a simple single voltage input, many voltage outputs, it seems to scale with the size of the system with not a very bad prefactor. So, for example, in the flow network examples I showed you, for a network of 1,000 edges, I could tune about 200 targets. Okay, and that was the proportionality factor. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about sort of the relationship between the two parts of your talk. So on one hand, there's this question about what makes it the case that nonlinear is different. And on the other hand, there's this question about like how do you solve problems with just a local learning rule?
What?
About how you solve problems with just a local
Yeah, learning rule.
And it feels like these are two quite different things, right?
No, they're actually
The
not.
first thing is a thing about inference, and the second thing is a thing about learning.
Yeah, so I guess the question is, how does something like the actin cortex maintain rigidity homeostasis? It has to adjust its parameters, which are the presence or absence of each edges. So, and it has to do that with a local rule. It cannot be doing that with a processor. Okay, so then the question becomes, what are the local rules? Okay, one of the local rules, it turns out, we know because the 3 examples I gave you, they all have these enzymes that cut filaments that are under low tension. So that's one of our local rules, how to cut. But what we found is that you cannot cut with that rule. Okay, cutting with that rule is very important. Okay, but if you now add edges, you also have to add edges randomly, or add edges. If you add them randomly, that doesn't work. So the edges also have to be added with some tension-dependent rule that we don't know. But that tells you, in biology, maybe that's what we should be looking for. Okay, so this is, I think, when you think about local rules, and I didn't say it, I'm really glad you brought this up. So these systems that are satisfying these input-output relations and adapting them in real time, they must be doing that by local rules, and then we need to figure out what those local rules are. And biochemists have figured out a lot of those local rules for us to say, oh, this protein does this protein does that. Okay, but then we still have to put it together and say, okay, how does that lead to doing something like that's approximating global gradient descent? Yeah. There are some questions up there.
So when you showed changing this unsat phase transition to a crossover, you talked about changing the energy function or the cost function, but did you also change the requirement for the condition to be considered satisfied, or you just changed the cost function?
We just changed the cost function.
And it went from sublinear scaling
to linear scaling. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and it got rid of the transition. So, yeah, there's a lot we don't know about this, because then you can say, well, in any given biological system, we don't know what the cost function is, right? we not only don't know what the local rules are, but we also don't know what the cost function is. And what it is going to change how many more is different. And so we need things like cruder than universality classes. It's not different power laws, but it's even just different classes of behavior. And we need to be able to categorize them, but we haven't started doing that. So I think we should start. Yeah. Yes, a question there and then one there. Yeah.
So you've made this electrical prototype. It shows really cool plans of 10 to the 9 nodes. It's going to be awesome. Have you started or have plans to make a forced mechanical based physical learning network? And sort of a follow-up to that is I know in a lot of soft matter systems you can get like topologically protected mechanical modes at boundaries and such, and so then this is a little bit different from the electrical system you have. What plans do you have?
Yeah. Yes. So we have the beginnings of a prototype of a mechanical version. So this is, again, Doug Durian with postdoc Lauren Altman. So we have a colleague in mechanical engineering, Cynthia Sung, who builds these things where you can have adjustable springs, and they're really just coils of plastic. And depending on how many coils you have, you can pull it out and have fewer coils, or you can add more coils. You can adjust the stiffness. So they're building things with that. It's sort of awkward. It's hard to know how to scale it down. Okay, but it's a start. Yeah. So they are trying to make mechanical versions. Another very interesting thing would be to do it in a microfluidic device, a fluid version. Yeah, hold on. Let's see. There's a question there, and then, yeah.
Fascinating talk. I was wondering whether you can build in also or optimize for robustness against noise. Maybe it relates to a first question, but in all of these things like topological and inverse design, you can build systems that are robust against different variations in your system here. Maybe building in robustness against noise would be a very important one. And I was wondering whether that could be a third.
Yes, so you can train, so what people often do with digital neural networks is to use dropout, right? Just dropout dropout nodes as you train, and we can do that too. So we haven't done that yet, but that's on our list of things to try to see whether we get more robust behavior when we do that. Yeah. Great question. Yeah.
So it seems to me that the electric circuit you designed is kind of like a computer that is specific to those machine learning problems. Instead of a computer for university.
It's an analog computer for solving machine learning problems.
I was wondering if this is sort of similar to something like, for example, Apple has a so-called they have one of some of the cores they claim to be specific to. They're particularly good at machine learning, like some new iPhones and iPads have neural engine, a special processor that makes machine learning models especially fast. So I was wondering if your design is sort of similar to their ideas.
I don't think so. I think theirs is still digital. Because
I was asking, do you know basically why these kind of neural engine are particularly good at machine learning?
I have no idea. I didn't even know that. So you're teaching me something. So I have no idea of how their thing works. But I would bet it's digital.
Not much publicly know about why this processor works pretty well.
Yeah.
But they are in some sense getting less digital, right? I mean, TPU's default is half precision. So if you want to push that down even further.
Right, 8 bits instead of. Yeah.
Maybe one more.
Let's see. How about there and then there? Yeah. Go ahead.
Maybe also related to the first question. So I'm guessing when you were training on the irises, you had 4 different types of irises, is that right? And
3.
3, and the sort of inputs for those different clusters of trainings were maybe well separated, maybe. if you give an input that's sort of an interpolation between two of them, does it give an interpolation on the output? Does that depend on whether it's like guaranteed for the linear case, but not for the nonlinear?
Not for the nonlinear case. Yeah, that's right. But I guess classification, we're doing something that's nonlinear in the end. We're saying it's this or it's this or it's that. So I'm not sure that's true, even in our linear networks. Yeah.
All right, well, let's give Andrea another round. Just to remind everybody, we have questions as normal in variant the courtyard.